I guess I was fairly apprehensive the whole time that I was flying in combat. And I guess there's good reason to feel that way. I'm there to cause a lot of damage and a lot of harm, and therefore they would like to damage me. And I was 25 years old at that time. Top Gun was really a thrill. I must have done well in actual combat because at the time I was just a lieutenant junior grade, which is a first lieutenant in the Air Force. And so I may have been the very first lieutenant junior grade to go through Top Gun. That was the dream of a lifetime come true. I had wanted to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot just like my dad from the time I was 10 years old. STS-27 was my third launch, and it was only the second launch after the Challenger accident. Well, I will never forget, we maneuvered the arm, and Mike Mullane was my arm operator, so he moved the arm over there, and we brought up the television image of the right wing, and I looked at what I was seeing, and I said to myself, we are gonna die. To be an airline pilot, there was mandatory age 60 retirement. I was a NASA astronaut until I was 50 years old. And so I looked at the situation, and I had known a number of Southwest airline pilots. And they were just like me. They were flying because they loved to fly. Well, there's a lot of piloting that goes into it, a tremendous amount of piloting that goes into it, because you're going to wind up passing other airplanes. You're going to get in a duel with another airplane that's fairly closely matched. So there's a ton of satisfaction from doing that. And hey, let's just talk about the racing itself. It's fun to fly low, but it's dangerous.
Swordfish is a great aircraft. It's often described as a World War I relic that should have been flying in Richthofen's circus. A United States naval aviator, when he was told that it was made by fairies, shrugged his shoulders and said, "That figures." It's otherwise described as slow, obsolete, it's canvas covered, and it's, as you know, it's called a Stringbag. But it was a great aircraft. Swordfish sank more ships than any other Allied aircraft. It was really a great aircraft. But flying up a Norwegian fjord in a wild snowstorm, it did occur to me that it might be nice if it had an enclosed cockpit.
I would think so. I would assume too, because of its slow speed handling characteristics, that it was an ideal carrier aircraft.
Absolutely. The Swordfish could go where no other aircraft could go.
And also take off in
That is correct.
the most adverse
Yes,
weather.
take off.
You're part of Force H in the
Yes.
Mediterranean. You're doing convoy escort duty,
Yes,
and you find out that your carrier is not steaming in the right direction. You're heading out into the Atlantic.
yes.
When did you find out that you were going after the Bismarck?
Well, we were going towards the convoy, then suddenly we turned to the north, towards Brest. At that time, it was our impression that we were going up to find Scharnhorst and Gneisenau to see if they had been repaired, and we're going out to join the Bismarck. Shortly after we turned, we heard that Hood had been sunk, which was really a disaster. Then we heard that, yes, we were going up to help in the Bismarck search. After that, we heard that Victorious, with Lieutenant Commander Esmond and 8 aircraft, had attacked the Bismarck, had hit her with 1 torpedo, and then the Bismarck was lost. On May the 26th, there was a big discussion as to whether flying conditions were adequate or not. It was determined that it was. So 8 of us took off on a search. Didn't see anything on the way back. On the way out, on our way back, picked up a report that a Catalina aircraft had reported a battleship. Perhaps with the wrong feelings, we felt that it might be pleasant that the Air Force and Home Fleet would be doing the attack, not us.
Yes.
Then shortly after that, we got a report that one of our swordfish had sighted the Bismarck. At that stage, we knew that we would be involved.
So you get your briefing, you're told that the only ship in the target area should
No,
be the
that was
Bismarck.
820 Squadron.
Oh, 820 Squadron.
Yes, they were told that there was only 1 ship in the aircraft.
Right.
They took off in horrible weather,
Can I say how many aircraft?
15.
15 on that strike. Okay.
15 aircraft. They got a radar contact, dove down, dropped their torpedoes. Fortunately, the majority of them exploded on contact or shortly after running. 3 torpedoes sped on their way to Sheffield. He avoided them by skillful ship handling. The captain of Sheffield, unlike the captain of, or the gunners on KG-5, recognized that we were swordfish and did not open fire on us. When we got back, when the 820 Squadron got back, they were feeling pretty glum about it. But
this was a fortuitous.
it
in
was
many
very
ways.
fortunate indeed that it happened, because when we were ranged, 818 Squadron was ranged for the second strike, we were armed with contact pistols. Now it seems bass-backwards to me that a contact pistol will be okay and won't explode when it hits the deck, but a magnetic head torpedo will explode. I don't understand it.
Leave that for the engineers.
Yes, but we were the weather was horrible.
Yes.
The ground crews were just outstanding.
Now, for your takeoff, are you waiting for the deck to rise?
You take off when the green flag comes down.
When the green flag comes in, you're going.
That's
when the
right.
deck's going down or going.
Yes,
So you gun the engine,
that's right.
make sure the mighty lift of these 2 wings
Right.
get you a lot. Now, of course, you've got a great wind coming over the.
Yeah, the green waves are coming over, but that wasn't a problem.
Right. So you get airborne, you make your way, you get a bearing to get to the Sheffield,
Yes,
you find Sheffield,
yes.
you find the Sheffield. Approximately how much time from the Sheffield to the actual sighting of the Bismarck?
On the first, it was about 30 minutes, I would say.
Okay.
On our first approach, we didn't find the Bismarck. So we turned back and went back to Sheffield. Went back again. And just before ETA, there was a very thunderous roar. The aircraft shook. And Bismarck had opened up on us with her main armament.
So 15-inch shells were
Yes.
directed at your
Yes.
fabric-covered biplane.
Yep.
Which, needless to say, survived
Yes.
if it was hit. Did you realize that's what it was, or?
Yes,
You
we
did?
recognized it. And we went straight down.
Yep.
And that was a scary moment too, watching the altimeter spin.
So from what height are you coming from?
About 5,000.
5,000. You do a 40-degree dive.
About that, yes. And then we suddenly saw the deck, and there was the Bismarck. We were just three. We were not with the rest of the squadron. But at the same time, the other squadron, the rest of the squadron was attacking, and we were attacking. And yes, of course, it's to our advantage that we were coming in from every angle.
Yes.
And there's no question about that.
Now you mentioned in your presentation that most of the anti-aircraft fire was going over
Yes.
and not underneath.
Yes, they couldn't depress their guns to where we were,
Right.
and also they couldn't bring their guns back. The German equipment was trained for fast aircraft,
Right.
and it wouldn't come back down slow enough for us, so most of the flak was above us and ahead of us.
So antiquity again.
Yes, much to our advantage. Yes,
Exactly. We
yes,
were prepared for it.
yes.
No, but a number of aircraft did come back shot up.
The majority of the aircraft,
And a few
practically
had to
all the aircraft had damage,
Yes.
one way or another,
And how much
except
damage?
for the one aircraft that didn't attack.
Right. Did your aircraft sustain very much damage?
Well, we had quite a few holes, yes.
Yes. Now, in your presentation,
But there were three that pranged,
right,
and they were write-offs.
Yeah. You mentioned in your presentation that you launched your torpedo, you made your turn,
Yes,
and then you reported a hit.
a hit on the port side.
And were there any other hits recorded?
Yes, at that time, no. After we got back on board, we convinced command that yes, there had been a hit on the port side. And then there was some discussion as to whether there had been a hit on the starboard side. That was not agreed to. But a little while later on, Sheffield reported that Bismarck was steering on a course of 340. The Admiral didn't believe Sheffield's report, saying that he had reported a reciprocal bearing. But shortly after that, one of the Swordfish reported that Bismarck was steering north.
So you had a swordfish in the air shadowing
There were
the
two
Bismarck.
Swordfish shadowing. And the first one reported that she was steering north at slowed speed. The second one reported that she was steering 340 again. Finally, command accepted that there was something radically wrong with Bismarck. They didn't know what it was, but there was joy. They figured, here, if something's wrong, we will be able to engage her. There was some discussion of launching a third strike on the 26th, but it didn't take place. On the 26th, the weather was clear, no problems. We took off, went on our way.
Now, when you say you took off, were you armed with torpedoes?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, this was the third strike.
Right.
And we had contact pistols.
And you were ordered to find the
14
Bismarck
of us took off.
and attack?
When we got there, the battle had started. It was very clear that the battle was told. We were told not to attack. It was a pretty awful scene. KG-5 and Rodney, Dorchester and Norfolk
And
were
Bismarck couldn't-
firing away. Bismarck hopelessly outgunned,
you couldn't-
out of control. Everything shot away. There was no bridge, no structure. Forward guns were blown away. afterguns were in a tilt because the ship was at 20 degrees. Finally, they stopped firing. The battleships continued firing for some time, and then they stopped firing. At that moment, King George V, Rodney, and Norfolk steamed off. Dorchester came in and dropped torpedoes. But by the time Dorchester dropped torpedoes, many people from the Bismarck had abandoned ship, and the sea was becoming full of survivors. Then Dorchester came in, torpedoed her. She rolled over on her starboard side, masses of bubbles coming out. And then Dorchester and a destroyer stopped, and seemingly were going to pick up survivors. And then, horribly, I mean, it couldn't believe it was happening. It shouldn't be happening. Dorchester and the destroyer steamed away, leaving those hundreds of survivors in the water. Of Hood's and Bismarck Ships Company, approximately 4,000 officers and men perished. There were 116 survivors, 113 from Bismarck and 3 from the Hood. Now, surely the officers and men of Hood deserved a better fate. Now, of course, Bismarck had to be destroyed. And of course, what the Germans caused was wrong. It was totally wrong. But am I wrong in thinking that the Bismarck survivors deserved a better fate? Am I wrong in thinking that this was a battle of brave men fighting for what they thought was right and dying in the process? We jettisoned our torpedoes and went back to the Ark Royal.
I was on a destroyer at that time, which was part of the escort taking the Bismarck out in the Atlantic, and we actually, the destroyers, were the origin of the British becoming aware of the fact that the Bismarck was on its way out, due to the fact that we had to refuel on the way out, and we did that in Bergen in Norway, where British airplanes then located us, and they were aware that the Bismarck was on her way out. Well, when the Bismarck then reached the point where she was going to get involved with the Hood and the Prince of Wales at that time, that's when we little guys, the destroyer, turned around and went back to Norway. And of course, the communication was not as immediate as it is today, and so we refueled again in Norway and went back to Germany, and when we arrived in Germany, we then learned that the Bismarck had been sunk. And that, of course, was quite a shock. On the other hand, nothing really shocks all that much in wartime. You do expect all kinds of things to go wrong, and that people die and that ships are sunk, and so it wasn't that much of a shock as it is being looked at today in 2020 hindsight.
Fast, nimble, powerful, swooping in on its targets with cannons roaring. It can be none other, the Fairey Firefly. In September of 1939, Fairey Aviation submits a design in answer to specification N540, the Fleet Air Arm's call for a two-seat naval fighter. By next June, the construction of a prototype is approved. Its maiden flight comes some 18 months later, in December of 1941. It is in those dark days, the early phase of the Second World War, that the Firefly first takes to the sky.
As a fighter, it wasn't bad. Its great secret was it was fitted with Youngman flaps, and these flaps gave it maneuverability and also extra range by proper use of them, and it was a great asset.
Slung under its wing, the Fairey Youngman flaps extend the Firefly's range over its predecessor, the Fulmar, by almost 2/3. Rolls-Royce Griffin engines give it power enough to see it through its long missions out at sea. Good low-speed handling make the Firefly well suited for naval service. On the carriers from which it operates, arrestor wires can bring a landing plane from 90 knots to a standstill in just 30 feet. Not a bit too soon, for a single mistake spells disaster. In July of 1944 comes Operation Mascot, a trial by fire. Barely even commissioned, the HMS Indefatigable is sent with its complement of Fireflies to engage the Tirpitz, Germany's deadliest battleship. Fireflies provide fighter cover for a series of strikes against the Kriegsmarine's Titan. The attack is ultimately unsuccessful, but the Firefly has proven itself. And while the Fleet Air Arm prefers to use American Hellcats and Corsairs in Europe, the Firefly sees extensive service with the British Pacific Fleet. In the Far East, fleet carriers resound to the sound of its comings and goings. It is sent in advance of bombing parties to clear the skies of Japanese fighters. Following the end of the war, Britain is generous. Allied nations stock their squadron with the proven craft. In Canada, Australia, Holland, and elsewhere, Fireflies take to the skies to defend the ships which they call home. In nearly a dozen nations and across 5 continents, the Firefly gives reliable service for over 2 decades. And wherever the kingdom's duty draws it, there it also goes. During the Korean War, British and Australian Fireflies fly ground attack raids and anti-shipping patrols in support of the Allied war effort. 6 squadrons operate from 5 carriers, including the HMS Implacable, Indefatigable, and Triumph. In Malaya, Fireflies operate in the ground attack role.
Very versatile, very much liked by the pilots, as indeed the Gannet had been, and it changed its shape about halfway through its career. Right up to the Mark 4 and 5, the Firefly was a good, useful aircraft, but not extraordinarily fast. It had very reasonable performance, but when it came to the Mark 4 and 5, the whole shape of the aircraft changed quite considerably, gave a much better performance, and indeed it was, if you add it up, it was one of the most versatile aircraft the Navy had, and robust and very reliable. It had a wonderful both engine and airframe reliability.
Proving its versatility, the Firefly goes on to evolve far beyond its intended role. At first as a night fighter and a reconnaissance craft, but toward the end of its life, most Fireflies are converted into anti-submarine aircraft. In this they precede another Fairey plane, the innovative Gannet. In 1956, the Fleet Air Arm trades Fireflies for Gannets. When the production line finally rolls to a stop, over 1,700 Fireflies have been built in a total of 22 types.
This is a nifty looking airplane. But what is it? It looks something like some other military planes, especially the P-51 Mustang, but look more closely and you realize its design is all its own. We see lots of Mustangs, B-17s, and C-47s, Corsairs, and Avengers. But very few of these, for good reason. Only 3 of them are flying in the world, and only one of them, one of the 2 you are looking at, is at home in the United States. Say hello to the British Fairey Aviation Company Firefly. 2 cockpits, big prop, a tail dragger with folding wings. It was carrier-based British Royal Navy and later flown by Australia, Canada, and the Dutch. The Firefly saw its first combat in World War II, July 1944, launched from the British aircraft carrier Indefatigable off the coast of Norway, which was under German control. It attacked the German battleship Tirpitz and other enemy ships in Norwegian waters. It was a reconnaissance day-night fighter and anti-submarine aircraft. So much of what we see on screens about World War II in the Pacific is about American forces. One of the best known was Victory at Sea on NBC with powerful, haunting music by Richard Rodgers. Battleships, aircraft carriers, the Battle of Midway, Marines and Army soldiers being slaughtered in attacks on Japanese-controlled islands day after day, month after month, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and many more. What is less known is that the British and Australian navies joined American fleets fighting the Japanese. One of their key weapons was the Firefly that attacked Sumatra, Japanese-controlled Formosa, now Taiwan, Truk Lagoon, and the home islands of Japan. Years later, Fireflies attacked North Korea in that horrible war. More than 1,700 Fireflies of various designs were built. It was the British Navy's most capable 2-seat fighter of World War II. Restoring iconic military aircraft requires vast amounts of time, money, and effort. Thousands of men and women, young and not so young, continue to volunteer to restore and maintain vintage aircraft so that all of us will never forget the people who designed, built, and flew these planes. Too many of them died, so that each of us can continue to live free and enjoy the privileges of freedom. One of those who has worked for years to restore great planes is Eddie Kurdziel. He's a retired naval aviator, flew the A-4, the F-8 Crusader, the A-7 Corsair, and the S-3 Viking. As a civilian, he's been a Delta captain for decades. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum's collection of more than 40 aircraft began with the purchase of the Fairey Firefly in 1979. The museum maintains and preserves Canada's aviation history as it continues to restore aircraft that are both great pieces of workmanship and airworthy.
Good afternoon, folks. On my left here is Eddie Kurtziel. He's the owner of this aircraft, and this is the EA Grand Champion of 2002. Next to him is Steve McIntosh, and he's from the Canadian Warplane Museum in Hamilton, Ontario. And next to him is Andy Dobson. Steve he's a pilot also, and he's flown a lot of different airplanes that they have in the museum, including the Firefly. Andy he's also from the museum. He's an active airline pilot, 787. He was retired from the RCAF, and he's currently don't have their airplane here. They're having maintenance issues right now, but they hope to have it next year. First of all, Eddie, what's the mission purpose of this airplane? Why was it designed?
The airplane was designed as a long-range reconnaissance fighter. So a lot of people think it's a torpedo plane. My friends that beat me up over this, but it really is a long-range fighter. So if you look at the airplane, when it was originally designed, it was a Mark I and Mark II. This is the Mark V, so there's a 4, 5, and 6. They look about the same. And the way this airplane is, the right pod was a radar, and so the guy in the back ran the radar and was also a navigator. So they did long-range reconnaissance, long flights over the water. So that's what the guy in the back did. Everybody asked if he was a gunner. He never was. And the airplane is really quite maneuverable. In fact, I ran the flaps through for you. That first position that you see, which is called cruise, the flaps come out like a biplane, parallel to the wings. The airplane even shot down a bunch of Oscars on the way to Japan. So that's what the airplane was designed as. And then as it aged, they turned it into a ground attack airplane, and that's what you see right here. And this is the way the airplane was painted when it was in Korea, and then it became an anti-submarine warfare aircraft after that, and it got replaced by, the U.S. was using the TBM at the time, and the Brits ended up using the Fairey Gannet. And if you guys have been coming to Oshkosh for a long time, and that's a turbine thing it's another Fairey product, which is a really weird, the wings fold up and everything.
Now, out of 1,702 produced, how many are still flying?
There are 2 right now. It's this airplane and the Canadian Warplane Heritage airplane.
And yours is close to being flying, is that correct? Okay, well, tell us about the restoration process of your airplane, where you got it, and you don't have to tell us the money, but, and then, the specifications and how's it configured now, and also the paint scheme.
This airplane, I originally saw a picture of this. I don't want to date myself, but it was in Flying Magazine. It was March or April of 1974. And I just remember it on the cover. And I mean, it was the coolest thing ever. I go, that is a really cool airplane. And that was a Canadian airplane. And that came here to Oshkosh. And I don't remember ever seeing it fly, but I actually saw the Royal Navy had an airplane in their historic flight that flew in England. And I saw that airplane fly, but that airplane crashed. And both guys were tragically killed, and those were flown by the reserves. This airplane was sold at auction in 1965. So what happened was this airplane served in the Royal Australian Navy. It was delivered in 1950, and I have a little signboard. You guys can come out afterwards and take a look at it. And then airplane flew until I think 56 or 57. Then they converted the airplane into a target towing airplane. So it had a tow package on the bottom of it. The only thing I left on the airplane that's from that era, there's like a little chute on the back, and that's where they used to push the banner out. And that was towed 3,000 feet behind this airplane, and the ships would shoot at it. So, yeah, guys told me that the guns were radar guided, and sometimes they'd lock onto the wire and start climbing their way up towards the airplane. So then that airplane as a target tug was operated by a private company called Brown and Brain. And they sold the airplanes at auction in 1965. A town called Griffith, New South Wales, which is like 4 hours west of Sydney. It's in a very agricultural area. It's kind of like Bakersfield, so it's really hot and dry. They bought the airplane for $400. They got somebody to donate the fuel. They flew the airplane to Griffith, and they put it up on a pole, and it stayed up there for like 40 years. And so it was just a big birdhouse. There was another Firefly flying in Australia that a guy had restored, and that airplane crashed. And so when it crashed, it broke its back, and they said, well, we can't restore it. It's going to cost too much money. So the people that I got the airplane from, I saw an ad in Trade a Plane. You guys shouldn't read that newspaper, as you know. And 60% restored Firefly, right? That's what it said. I said, oh, this would be so cool to have this in it. I'll just get it to fly. And so basically they were the ones that negotiated with the town for 2 years to take it off the pole. And the town said, well, you can't take all of it because it's a historic landmark. This airplane flew in Korea, you know, so you can have the body, but you can't take the wings or the tail. So this is the wings and the tail off of 828 and the body off of the one that was on the pole. We figured, well, the serial number follows WB518, and that's the airplane that was on the pole. And the wings and the tail are actually, I don't even know if they're off of 828. We don't know what they came from, because if you look at the serial numbers and the dates, one wing is 1951, the other wing is 1948, the tail is 1946. So I think anytime the airplanes came aboard ship and they were damaged, they would just take parts out of stores and just repair the airplane. So we figured the serial number follows the fuselage. So this is WB518. And so this is 45,000 man-hours restoration. It was restored from, I bought the airplane in 94. I first saw it in Trade a Plane in 1993. And out here in the audience, I have to recognize a guy because I'm just Jacques' custodian. And out here in the audience is Tim Fries. Tim, if you'll stand up. He started when he was like 12 working on this thing. I won't tell you how old he is now. But he's the one that basically built this whole airplane in QG Aviation of America out in Fort Collins in Colorado. So that's who did the airplane, and that's what you see now.
Okay, how about the paint job?
Paint job was done by Ron
What does it
Maley.
represent? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it represents Korea. This is exactly how this airplane was painted. It was the CO of the squadron's airplane. So with the blue spinner, that's the significance of the blue spinner. The rest of the airplanes had gray. One of the other squadron, so you could always identify the CO. They may have had a red spinner or something like that. So, but that's what this is exactly the way it was painted in Korea. And you have to remember, it's a ground attack airplane. So this carried either 2 1,000-pound bombs or 16 60-pound warhead rockets that you can see underneath, where they mount just about underneath the guns, and the guns are 4 Hispano Mark V 20-millimeter cannons.
Now, in the other variants, it was a torpedo bomber?
No, it never was a torpedo bomber. I said that's what my friends give me a hard time about. But no,
So that was the armament right there.
That's the armament. That's correct.
Well, how does the airplane fly? I mean, you got a lot of time in it.
I mean, yeah, I've got about almost 400 hours in the airplane. It's a big machine. It's like what you see. I mean, all up gross weight is 16,100 pounds. So if you look at you guys are familiar with PC-12s. A PC-12 fully loaded weighs what this does empty. So I mean, it's a big airplane, and you do not want to get the airplane slow. I mean, it flies kind of like an underpowered jet. That's what you come through the 90, you're doing maybe 120 knots and slow. They brought it aboard the ship in the 90s, 90 knots, 92, 93 knots when it came aboard ship. The problem with that is you're kind of on the backside of the power curve, and if you look at the prop, it turns the wrong way. So it's a ton of left rudder, and I mean, it's uncomfortable when you're bringing the throttle up. So I typically wheel land the airplane, and it's with the maneuvering flaps down, like I showed you, the cruise flaps, when they're in that position, the airplane could outturn the zero. And the airplane was tested at Pax River. They brought all kinds of Allied airplanes back at the end of the war, and there's a bunch of test reports that I found, and it described the whole airplane and how well the thing maneuvered. So,
what kind of range do you have in it?
With the drop tanks that are on here now, the lowest you can get the fuel burn down to in U.S. gallons, because it's all Imperial, is just under 2 gallons a minute. If you're flying an air show, about 4 gallons a minute. So once the drop tanks are gone, the main fuel gauge, they feed immediately into the main tank. You don't really have a quantity indication for the drop tanks, but when it starts burning out of the main tank fuel gauge is just like a clock. So, I mean, that's gallons, and you go, that's how many minutes I have left. And it's
when you're across country, what do you?
Yeah, about 2 hours. So 400 miles, 220 knots we did coming out here. That's flying at max range, which is 160 knots indicated. I mean, in level flight, you can do, without the tanks, probably 330 indicated to be top speed. And then going downhill, red line's 380 knots.
Any particular quirks about it?
It's a pretty honest airplane. It's just a big machine. I mean, that's the one thing you have to realize. It's heavy. The wings are pretty heavily loaded, and for a fighter, I mean, it does aerobatics and everything, but you just don't want to get slow in it. I think that's what killed the Royal Navy airplane, and the two guys that were in an air show. So
Steve, tell us a little bit about your museum, a little history of your museum.
Well, it was started by Dennis Bradley and a few others back in '71, I think. But the first airplane was a Firefly. And I think the original intention was to use it as a racer for Reno. And it was soon discovered it wasn't really practical to do that. But they started collecting more airplanes. They got a Harvard, a Chipmunk, and a few other airplanes started to add. But by the 80s, it was a fairly going concern, and we had acquired a Lancaster, which is now the queen of our fleet. I think it first flew back in 1989, and we continue to add more airplanes, so it's actually more of a world-class museum now.
How about the history of the airplane, the Firefly that you have up there you're working on now?
Well, the original aircraft that started the Warplane Heritage Museum in Hamilton was a Firefly. Unfortunately, it was lost in 1977 at Toronto International Air Show. But in 1979, we were able to acquire in Australia another Mark VI Firefly and brought that back to Canada. It had a long-term restoration project out in Victoria, British Columbia, and finally got back to the museum almost 20 years after the original one was lost in 1997. It is a Mark VI, but Canada never used Mark VIs, so it's painted as a Mark V that was flown out of Shearwater and on the HMCS Magnificent Carrier.
Now, all of you have flown lots of other warbirds. How would you compare this to other warbirds you've flown, particularly in the museum, and also for you, Eddie?
Well, I'll back up what Eddie said, that the feel of it is more like a straight-wing jet than it is almost any other piston airplane I've flown, only with tons of torque. It is very honest, it's powerful, it's fast, and the most remarkable feature I find is how well harmonized the controls are. The roll rate, the pitch rate, the forces, everything works just beautifully with each other.
Well, any of you, how well did it fulfill its mission requirements?
it did a really good job with mission requirements just by the length of time that it remained in service. Because, I mean, there are very few airplanes that stayed in service for, you know, this airplane was designed in 39. I first flew in 41. First combat mission was 44. And you figure it operated until 65.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a long time. I mean, and they made some of them into drones, too. So they were remotely piloted, and they shot those down with meteors and stuff like that to try out missiles and different armament.
Was there any particular reason that the cockpits are so far separated?
I don't know. There's a fuel tank in between, and
okay,
nobody likes that.
Yeah. You got a little flying bomb there, I guess. Well, what do you guys get out of flying this around the country and showing it to the different people personally?
You know, when I first finished the restoration, I mean, it was 8 years. I mean, it was a tough road to hoe. I mean, I had no idea. I mean, I think I'm kind of dyslexic, so when I look at a project, I kind of imagine what it looks like in the end and then kind of work backwards to figure out how I'm going to do it. You know, otherwise I would never do it. You know, you start at step 1 and go step 300,000 something. I mean, it's just overwhelming. And I think because I've flown fighters and all this stuff before, you know, the airplane was kind of underwhelming when I flew it the first time, and I was just relieved that it was just done. You know, I mean, I was just like so happy the project was finished. I can't take any more. It's just too hard. And people go, well, that's pretty anticlimactic. And I'd say maybe 7 or 8 years into flying it, all of a sudden I realized, you know, what I got to do. And it's just an absolute privilege because, I mean, if this thing could just talk, I mean, it's when you're alone with it in the hangar, cleaning it off or something at the end of, you know, flying it, it's basically 40 hours of my time for every flight hour. And that's not the mechanics, that's just me. I mean, that's to put it away, to clean it, to keep it, to make it look the way it does, to pre-flight it, to get ready to go on an air show some places. Takes probably 2 days. And somebody said, well, what don't you get? When these airplanes were in service, 100 people took care of 3 of them. And I keep waiting for the other 30-some guys to show up, but they haven't showed up yet. So, you know, it's just an overwhelming amount of work. I mean, just even to bring this here, it was 15 hours a day. Tim and I worked, you know, and it's just you think it's going to be easy. It just doesn't happen that way. But flying it, you know, the airplane really belongs to all of you guys, and I have to recognize all the Australians that are out here that have come from halfway around the world to see this. In fact, we have Air Marshal is out here too from the Royal Australian Air Force, and I know he's not a Navy guy, but we'll accept him. But you know, the airplane is really important to a lot of people, and I understand that. You know, the more you fly it, to realize it's never going to be yours. You know what I mean? I paid a lot of money to be Jacques' custodian, like I said, and it's you just get to take care of it and pay for it, and then hopefully it'll go on to somebody else. You know
How about you, Andy?
I can only echo what Captain Eddie has said, that it's such a privilege to be able to keep that history alive and to show it to new generations of people, to invoke that memory of the sacrifices made by those who went before us, who used them operationally, instead of us doing it when the sun's shining and everyone's happy.
So you feel yourself lucky to be able to fly it?
Oh, it's an incredible privilege to be able to fly an aircraft like that, not only for the rarity, also for the joy of flying it, and also to participate in the museum activities with it.
How about you, Steve?
Well, my initial impression was that it looked like it would be something really cool to fly. But certainly I have a strong feeling for the historical aspect of it, but I remember taking it to a show near Ottawa, and finally I met a veteran who had flown them, and it was a very emotional experience for him, so that's kind of sticks in my mind.
Yeah, I haven't had the opportunity to meet a lot of veterans. I met a Dutch guy that flew with these in Indonesia, and his description of this in combat was unbelievable. I mean, he said, oh, it was just magnificent when they came in for the strafing runs on the guys that were fighting in Indonesia. He said, you know, the Hawker hunters would come in and drop bombs, and then the Firefly would come in and strafe them. And he said, she is beautiful, he said, and this is absolutely magnificent. I'm going, oh, yeah, okay. And there was another guy, we tried to bring him this year as one of the, he was a test pilot. He went on to become the Tornado test pilot and the Typhoon test pilot, and he was involved in a midair with these when he went to Australia at 21 years of age. They decided to go on an exchange with the Royal Australian Navy, and he and his best friend went down there, and his best friend did a head-on pass on a flight of 3 when they were up doing navigator training, and hit his airplane. And he said there was a big thump when he went by. He said he looked out and 7 feet of his wing was gone. And you know, you talk to these guys, and they're the ones that actually flew it. There's just very, very few people left that actually operated the airplane. And you guys all saw Bridges over Toko-Ri with Mickey Rooney and the helicopter and all that stuff. That was about a Firefly crew that was shot down in Korea and was rescued by the Navy crew that came and picked them up, because they had a Sikorsky helicopter stationed on board HMS Sydney. And Hank, I got to meet the guy that was in the back seat, was still alive. And he escaped the North Koreans, and it was the U.S. helicopter that picked him up. And so the whole thing in the movie was actually about a Firefly that was shot down in Korea.
Okay, we've got, have you got anything else that you'd like to add right now? We're going to have question and answer.
Go ahead.
How about some Q&A? I got to get my mics out here.
Do you have a Merlin or a Griffin?
It's a Griffin. So this is the largest V12 that Rolls-Royce ever built. It's 1,000 cubic inches bigger than the Merlin, 38 liters of swept volume. Stock horsepower is 2450, and the way it's restored, if we had 150 octane fuel, which we don't have, probably 3,000. We've got 58 heads and banks on, so it's only an estimate. We haven't been able to run it at that.
Does it have a TBO or not?
I wish it had a TBO. But like halfway through life, you know, I think if you really take care of it, maybe 800 hours, maybe. You know, the first engine we had in this, we pulled the heads and banks at 150. They were leaking coolant. I mean, it's been problematic, but I think the guys at Vintage V12s have worked on this. I mean, I don't know of anybody else in the world that can really overhaul one right now, but they've made all the molds for the seals and everything. And right now, you know, knock on wood, this new engine, I mean, there wasn't a leak all the way from Colorado, which is really amazing. It's because that has never happened with this airplane. So I think they've done 9 engines after this one was restored, and this was kind of the test engine. So now the new one's in here, and it's pretty fantastic. It's more durable than a Merlin because of the cam setups and all that kind of stuff.
When the British Pacific Fleet equipped itself, they used a few of these, but mostly they used Corsairs and Hellcats and Avengers. How did this compare with the American-built aircraft, not only operated by the United States Navy, but also by the Royal Navy in terms of performance and capability?
You know, like I told you before, they brought a Firefly back to Pax River, and I can't remember the name of the book, but it's a whole series of tests that they did with every aircraft. I talked to Eric Brown at length, who was, and I think you guys know who he was. You know, he's had more carrier landings than anybody ever, and he just died a couple of years ago. He was at 96 years of age, and he was really a great guy. And I asked him, I said, what do you think? And he compared it very favorably with it was like Hellcat. And it shot down a lot of Oscars on the way. You know, they did all the Jimas, you know, Ichijima, Chichijima, all on its way up to Japan.
So how many were operational in the Pacific at that time? Do you have any idea?
Oh, I have no idea. You know, you'd have to read the history, and I remember which squadrons went there, and they were on a number of carriers. And then, like I said, in Korea, then it turned into a ground attack airplane. That's why the invasion stripes are on it, because there were other propeller airplane there, but they were Yaks, and so they didn't want the jets to shoot them down, and so that's why you see the invasion stripes on the airplane. And they're from Korea.
Next.
Over here.
Okay.
Just a question. Why is there a shield on the port exhaust stacks?
Oh, there's a shield on both sides, and those are basically flash hiders for night flying. So, and because the flames will just blind you, so you can't see them with the flash hiders on there.
Put it right on your chin.
Captain Eddie, tell us about your travels to find parts for the airplane during the restoration time. Where did you have to go to get the parts?
Well, basically, once I bought the airplane, you know, I saw the thing, and I go, you know, this is an undervalued thing. You know what I mean? People don't know what it is in the U.S. They've never seen it before. You know, the Canadians had theirs, and theirs, you know, was tragically lost in '77. So I figured, you know what? Now's the time to buy stuff. So I mean, I traveled all over the world to buy everything. I had flown on exchange with Royal Australian Navy guys that were in the U.S. Navy with me, and so the Royal Australian Navy has a historic flight. And their historic flight operated an S2, a Firefly. They've got a Sea Fury, Iroquois helicopter. And the reserves flew those airplanes to their air shows. We don't have, you know, Britain has the same thing with the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, where they have, you know, active duty and reserve guys fly those airplanes. We don't have anything like that here. I mean, this is all private individuals. So what happened was, everybody goes, oh, well, you can trust this guy because we've flown with him, we know him, and what would ever be the strange fate that I would end up with an airplane from Australia. So basically, they had a lot of the spares I needed, and I had all the spares they needed. So we traded all this stuff back and forth, and of course, you're dealing with the government, so it's hard, and that all happened. And then I traveled. Someone saw an article about me in Smithsonian. I'll give you a couple of just quick stories, and he had a bunch of Griffin engine stuff. He said, the Smithsonian called me and they said, hey, this guy wants to email you. And I said, yeah, go ahead and email. Let him, I don't care. So he goes, I have a bunch of stuff that you want. And I go, what do you have? And he goes, I have all this Griffin stuff. And I go, how'd you get that? And he goes, he didn't say. So basically traveled to Cyprus, and there's a base there called RAF Akrotiri, and that they flew the Shackleton bombers out of there. And so some Greek Cypriot guy, I mean, I must have been kind of crazy, but he bought 2 of the Shackleton bombers, and what came with the Shackleton bombers were 16 containers of spares. And so he defaulted on the, I mean, there's just no way you'd have money to take care of any of this stuff, right? So, you know, the last Shackleton is here in the U.S., it's at Pima Air Museum. And so I can use the heads and banks off of those engines, of the 58s. And so he had 52 boxes of brand new overhauled 58 heads and banks. So I got to have that stuff, right? So I traveled to Cyprus, and the guy turned out to own a salvage company, the largest salvage ships in the Mediterranean. He's the guy that carried the Russian Mir submarines to dive on the Titanic. So that's just one guy. The spinner and cowls, they were wrecked. You know, they were on an airplane that had crashed. And so a friend of mine in Australia said, I know where there's a set of spinner, there's a spinner and some cowls. So the mechanic said, well, it's going to cost like $50,000 to make a spinner. And I'm going, no, that doesn't sound good. So they were on the wall of a bar. I go, where's the bar? And they go, we have no idea. So 6 months later, he calls me, he goes, I found the bar. It's in Melbourne. So we flew an air show. We're in Tasmania. And then on the way back, we said, well, let's go to Melbourne and we'll look at it. And sure enough, there it is up on the wall of the bar. I mean, it painted with shark's teeth and it had like a little picture of a firefly next to it. And I go, I got to have this stuff. So we talked to the bar. They go, we're not going to sell it. It's an integral part of our decor. I go, okay. Oh, that sucks. So 6 months later, I get a call. Guess what? The bar's on leased land. They're building the convention center. The bar has to be torn down. I go, oh, good. So he goes, everything is up for auction. So in between the ladies' soap dispensers and the men's urinals was a thing called the bomb aimer nose. And the bomb aimer nose is this spinner and these cowls. And so my friend said, I said, can you go bid on it? He goes, no, I can't. I got a cell phone. I got another guy that's going to do that. So I call up at the end. I said, wait, I got to have it. I mean, I don't care what it costs, but don't tell the auction people because they'll just raise the price on me and that'll kill me, right? I mean, they could make $1 trillion off of me. So long story longer, he calls me up. I said, good news and bad news. And I said, what's the good news? He goes, or bad news? He goes, my cell phone died halfway through the auction. I go, oh, that's not good. I said, what's the good news? He goes, you have the bomb aimer nose. He goes, but you paid more for that than anything in the auction. How much did I pay? He goes, $1,500 Australian, which is like $1,000. I go, oh. So then he said, well, you know, the Navy can't pick it up for you, but I have a guy that's going to take care of it over there. So we're just going to put it in his warehouse. So a year later, good news and bad news. The bomb aimer nose is at the Naval Air Station Nara, which is south of Sydney, but it's all damaged. He said the spinner's crushed, the cowls are all scratched up. I go, well, it didn't look like that on the wall, so we don't know who did it. The guy that stored it or were the workmen taken off the wall or whatever. He goes, good news and bad news. We have a guy here that can fix it, but you have to buy him a microwave for their shop. I said, okay, here's the microwave. So he fixes it all up. It gets shipped to Colorado. Good news and bad news. The bomb aimer nose is here, but the forklift tines went through the box. I go, oh, no, you got to be kidding me. So it got restored one more time. And then a friend of mine tells me 2 years later there was a Made for Australia TV show that was on, and somebody was going to attack and kill the Prime Minister. You got to remember this is a show. And they opened up the container. They were smuggling an F-4 into, this is a TV show, right? They're smuggling an F-4 in a 40-foot container to attack the Prime Minister. And he said when they opened the container up, he goes, guess what was in the container? I go, what was in the container? He goes, the bomb aimer nose. So that's just one part.
Was that the hardest part to get?
No, that wasn't.
What was the hardest part?
I don't know. I mean, the engine stuff. Everything is hard. I mean, nothing is easy. And the problem is, but all of you guys out here that restore airplanes and do everything, you know, this is all British, right? So it's not metric, it's not AN, it's all British. And so the hardware is extremely expensive. And like the screws, the thread pitches are different. The angles of the heads are all different. And so you have to buy everything from England or some Commonwealth country. And this stuff, since eBay has arrived, it's good and bad. Because a lot of this stuff are sitting on people's shelves. Oh, I got a Firefly part at home, and it's sitting on my shelf, and it's like something I need, right? And so the airplane that crashed, that went up on the pole in Griffith. That's still up there. And you know what? That's like all the spare parts are sitting up on that pole. It's like I want those things.
Which wing is from 1948?
Well, I don't know. You'd have to come over here and look at it. You can come look and see what the little tag says. I'm not sure which one it is, but you know how we found that out is we were putting a bunch of bolts in it, and they didn't fit. And I go, you ordered, these things were high-strength bolts, and I said, you ordered all this stuff. I can't believe you ordered stuff that doesn't fit. And he goes, the two wings are different, and that's how we figured it out.
relating to the parts that you've purchased, what do you think your total cost is for restoring this airplane?
We'll just say it's a lot.
And then just my other comment, Steve, your museum in Hamilton is fabulous.
Yep.
It's a couple Mustangs worth. Good Mustangs.
Is there a reason the British engines turn the wrong way compared to the American engines?
I think it's the same reason why they drive on the wrong side of the road. But you know what? Someone pointed out to me once. They said, in the Navy airplanes, it actually works out pretty good because, you're always flying a left pattern, right? So as you come through the 90, if you get slow and you stall the airplane, which way does it roll? It's going to roll to the right. So it's going to roll more upright. What's a U.S. plane do? It rolls to the left and it goes right in. So. And you can see pictures up. They have a lot of, if you guys go online, you can look, guys getting in close wave-offs, and because it does turn the wrong way, the airplane goes to the right. There's a picture of one of these sticking out of the funnel on one of the carriers. I mean, it flew right into the island.
I think you said that this was a radar, and the radar operator was back there. So the radar's gone. What is the backseat for?
He's just a navigator then. And in fact, you know what? They even took him. He was a navigator for the whole time in Korea. But there were always two guys in the airplane. And in fact, when it towed targets, he was the guy that got to stuff the target out through that chute that's on the bottom.
Could you tell us what the prop diameter is?
14.9. So it's supposedly the biggest prop that was ever put on a British fighter.
And also, we want to promote flyingtv.com. They're the ones that are filming this, and it's live streamed now, and it's going all over the world. You can wave now and see your mother can see you. And thanks again for coming. Really appreciate it.